Topic I've called A Tale of Two Nobels. Apologies to Charles Dickens. Liu Xiaobo won the Peace Prize in 2010. Mo Yan the Literature Prize in 2012. As you know, Mo Yan's real name is Guan Moye, which you may know as well. Both born, as Clay just told you, in the year 1955, which means they both shu yang. They're both sheep. You can infer from that what you like. I want to start by sharing, you probably know all this, but why Nobel Prizes are so important in China especially. They're important anywhere, of course, but especially in China with its quasi-self-narrated version of its recent history with humiliation by foreigners and so on, and now that China rises, there's a tremendous thirst, not only in the government, but pretty widespread, for symbols of international respect. Olympic gold medals are so important, partly for this reason. Nobel Prizes, of course, are important for the same kind of reason. The underlying insecurity, if you will, that tremendous thirst shows is especially poignant, I think, for the Literature Prize, where, after all, China hands over determination of its value in cultural matters to a committee of Swedes, who one of them knows Chinese, the others don't. Mo Yan also won the Mao Dun Prize in 2010, but I don't think anyone in China, and I bet Mo Yan, in fact, I'm confident that Mo Yan himself doesn't, value the Mao Dun Prize more than his Nobel Prize. Yet, the record for China has been very frustrating in the search for Nobel Prizes. There have been 8 Chinese who have won Nobel Prizes in the natural sciences. 6 of these, though, were citizens of Western countries when they won: the US, the UK, and France. The other 2 were officially citizens of Taiwan, Yang Zhenying and Li Zhengdao, later very friendly with the PRC government, but still there's no homegrown Nobel Prize winner there. There is one Chinese Peace Prize winner before Liu Xiaobo. Who knows? Dalai Lama, yeah. Which is a special dilemma for the government, because you can't exactly say, well, he's not Chinese, because then you're implying perhaps Tibet is not China. So that's awkward. The Literature Prize has had a number of close calls, especially from the regime's point of view, before Mo Yan finally got it. Pearl Buck won in 1938. Not exactly Chinese, but half Chinese. She grew up in China and spoke Chinese, wrote about China, wrote well about China, at least when she was writing carefully. Some of her later stuff was a little bit flaky. But I don't have to tell you that it doesn't scratch the itch for Chinese people that Pearl Buck won. Lao Shu, 1968. You all know the wonderful Beijing Hua writer Lao Shu. In 1968, I can't promise you that this is true, but it's widely enough said by people that I more or less trust that I think it probably is basically true. He was on the list. And Sweden sent a cable to Beijing, to their embassy, and said, can you confirm for us that Lao Shu is still living, because you have to be alive to win the Nobel Prize. And the embassy couldn't confirm it, and so he didn't get the prize. And it's good they didn't confirm it, because in fact he had died 2 years before, committed suicide at the hands of Red Guard persecution. Shen Zongwan, and I do have stronger evidence here, was on the short list. That's not your foot. Shen Zongwan, a wonderful writer about West Hunan culture, hill culture. I'm not going to spend time introducing all these writers for you, but a very good, deserving Chinese writer, was on the short list in 1988 and 1988, would likely have got the prize had it not been that he died right before that decision was made. The member of the Nobel Committee who reads Chinese, Goran Malmquist, has told me this, so I think that's most likely true. Then Gao Xingjian wins the prize. In the year 2000, Gao Xingjian grew up in Beijing. His parents were scholars of French literature. He knew French from his early years. The trouble with that is, well, there were two. One is that in the year 2000, he'd already moved to France and officially become a French citizen. The other was, from the government's point of view, that he roundly denounced the government. And I won't go into the details there. But that, for a lot of Chinese people, and especially for the official circles, also was not satisfying as a Nobel Prize winner. The official media at the time said this about Gao Xingjian's prize, that the Nobel Selection Committee had lost authority, quote unquote, and was, and I quote, a small clique of so-called literary experts who harbor extremely unhelpful attitudes towards the Chinese people. So, finally, after all of these frustrations and near misses, we do have these homegrown and unequivocal Nobel Prize winners, Liu Xiaobo in 2010 and Mo Yan in 2012. As Clay just told you, Liu Xiaobo's prize probably was mostly a consequence of his sponsorship of this Citizens Manifesto called Charter 08. He was not an original drafter of it. And I know this because he and the other drafters dragooned me into being, I got to start translating that document before it was out. And 2 or 3 months in advance, they were sending me drafts and redrafts. And Liu Xiaobo near the end was calling up and saying, change this, take out mention of the Falun Gong, add this, don't do that. And I finally stopped. I said, no, no more changes, not because I was stubborn, but because 303 had already signed it in Beijing, and here he was ad-libbing for them. I thought, have you checked with the other 303 about this? And no, of course he couldn't. There was big time pressure, so I said, no, I'm not going to change that. So if you read those documents carefully, you'll note that my official English translation and their announced official Chinese version differ in certain ways. I got some flack on the internet for that. You know, Perry-Link can't translate and stuff because look, this is left out. But that was on purpose. We had two sort of different versions. I'm digressing. I don't want to go way into that. Anyway, Charter 08, if you've read it, you'll see it's more or less a motherhood and apple pie kind of statement. There's nothing inflammatory or radical, and certainly nothing violent in it. It calls for human rights and constitutional government and elections and protection of the environment and a more rational banking system, and it's pretty long and very reasonable. The one point that's stuck in the craw of the government, I'm pretty sure, is the end to the one-party system. He didn't say abolish the Communist Party of China, but end the one-party monopoly on power of the Communist Party of China. Whether or not my speculation is correct, he was, of course, detained and then arrested officially 6 months later and then sentenced officially 6 months after that on Christmas Day in 2009, sentenced to 11 years in prison. That shock, I think, is what got him the prize. That's ironic, huh? In a sense, the party gave him the prize by doing that. It drew the attention of world-level peaceniks, Václav Havel, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu. These people wrote separately and jointly to Stockholm saying, we support his nomination. And then one thing led to another. So the Charter 08 leads to the prison sentence, which leads to his winning the Nobel Prize. I went to Stockholm and translated for some of his friends and so on. And at the banquet sat next to a woman who was one of the only 5 people on this Nobel committee. And so, of course, I asked her the obvious question, you know, how come you picked Liu Xiaobo and stuff? And she didn't tell me all of the stuff I just speculated to you. But she did say they had been considering for about 2 decades various Chinese dissidents, so-called, and this year it just seemed right. And in that phrase, I infer that it was this sentence and the support of the world-renowned peace advocates that tipped the balance. Anyway, the Chinese government was very angry at that. Even before the announcement, when it was rumored that he was on the list, they sent people to Stockholm to warn the Swedes, you better not do this or else. And that didn't work. The distinction between the Nobel Committee and the Swedish government, I think, was lost on an authoritarian government who figures we're in charge of everything. You probably are too. But the Nobel Committee is independent of the Swedish government. Then there were celebrations in Chinese cities among Liu Xiaobo's friends when the news spread. Just at the conference, where's our Princeton Conference? Just at our conference, I was sitting next to a guy from Beijing, and I said, "What did you think at the Beijing campus when you heard this news?" And he said, "Oh, we all Chuanhua. We talked to each other, but kept it under a lid." But some of them didn't. They went to parties. The police were ordered to come in and dasan the parties. And then, of course, Liu Xiaobo's spouse, Liu Xia, was put under house arrest, where she remains to this day. And the Chinese government urged the embassies in Oslo of other countries not to attend. And about 1/3 of them, about 18 of them, didn't attend. And 42 or 43 or something didn't listen and did come. Now, this harsh reaction from the Chinese government is a little bit well, it's overblown for several reasons, but partly because I think it wasn't the purpose of the committee to offend them. In the speech where the prize was given to the empty chair that Liu Xiaobo would have been in, Thorbjörn Jagland, pardon my Swedish, gave this speech, said this about offending China. "We can, to a certain degree, say that China, with its 1.3 billion people, is carrying mankind's fate on its shoulders. China must be prepared for criticism and regarded as positive, as an opportunity for improvement, not negative criticism." I don't know about Ha. I think he meant this. He went on to say, "Many Americans were opposed to the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Martin Luther King in 1964. Looking back, we can see that the USA grew stronger when the African American people obtained their rights." I think he's, partly serious there. He's saying, this is a 善意的规劝. We're trying to help you be better, right? Anyway, 2 years later, Moyen does get this prize, and there's been, of course, a lot of speculation that I can't prove one way or another, that this too was a sort of an olive branch or a mollification to the Chinese government on behalf of Scandinavia. "We know we offended you in giving it to Liu Xiaobo. We didn't mean, well, our purpose wasn't to offend you, but," and so this helped Moyen to be able to get the prize. Don't write it down that I said that that's true. I don't know that that's true. It does make sense to me, though. It makes considerable sense. For one thing, because I think on purely literary criteria, it was sort of an odd choice. It was rumored in advance that the Japanese writer Haruki Murakami was also on the list. And even on a Chinese list of writers. We can all have our different opinions, but he wouldn't be my number one. And so it's reasonable to speculate that this too was a quid pro quo sort of thing. Anyway, the reaction in Beijing to this announcement was quite different. Li Changchun, who was on the Politburo at the time, wrote a letter to the Chinese Writers Association, the official writers group in China, saying that this prize was not only an embodiment of the flourishing progress of Chinese literature, but also an embodiment of the continuing rise in the overall strength of our state in its international influence. So co-opting this prestige to build the prestige of the state. Other media said that finally a mainstream, quote-unquote, Chinese had won the Nobel Prize, for which the Chinese people have waited too long. No one in the official press noted the irony that the people who'd made this wonderful decision just 2 years ago were, and I quote again, a small clique of so-called literary experts who had harbored extremely unhelpful attitudes. At the same time, local officials in Shandong, where Mo Yan is from, set up a big tourist bonanza site called the Mo Yan Culture Experience Zone that cost, according to press reports, $110 million equivalent. I don't think that's entirely a political response there. That's obviously partly a commercial response as well, in a way to lao qian from this unexpected bonanza. But, as you probably know, very quickly on the internet, there were criticisms of the giving of the prize to Mo Yan from what we loosely call netizens. I'll review for you what the three main criticisms that I noticed are. One is that, and these are all criticisms of Mo Yan's political stances that he has taken. In October 2009, Mo Yan, who is a vice president of the Chinese Writers Association, went to the Frankfurt Book Fair and read an officially vetted speech, which was innocuous enough, I guess. But then things came to a head when Dai Qing and Bei Ling, two sort of dissident or quasi-dissident writers, also came to the fair, and the Chinese delegation, on orders, apparently left. And Mo Yan left. And the press grabbed him and say, "Why are you leaving?" And he said, truthfully, I think, that I had no choice. Well, maybe that's not truthful. I mean, it's true that he had a pressure on him, and we can sympathize with that. But anyway, he was roasted on the internet for having done that. In 2009, when Liu Xiaobo's prize, when his sentence was announced, one of his friends, a woman named Cui Weiping, who is a professor of Chinese film in Beijing, did a telephone survey among prominent Beijing intellectuals saying, "What do you think of an 11-year prison sentence for this peaceful advocate?" And it's a no-brainer question, but of course it's a very difficult question, because to think one thing is one thing, to say it and to allow Cui Weiping to publicize it is quite another thing. So she always asked, "Can I publicize what you say?" And a lot of writers did say, "That's an outrageous sentence." I can't remember all the different things they said. "And yes, you can quote me." She called up Mo Yan, and he said, and I quote, "I'm not clear on the details and would rather not comment. I have guests at home right now, and I'm busy." And she asked, "Can I publicize that comment?" And he said, "Yes." It's the approval of the publication of the comment that's almost more important than the comment itself. Then in June 2012, this is what, less than a year ago, the 60th anniversary of Mao Zedong's famous talks at Yan'an, that for many years, from the time of the talks until after Chairman Mao died, were the official statement of, you'd call them the shackles for Chinese writers. And when I first worked in China for an extended period of time in 79, 80, working on scar literature at the time, all the writers, all the intellectuals were utterly contemptuous of these talks at Yan'an and felt so great that now we're liberated from it. Well, you know, but now 60 years later, the 作家出版社 decides we're going to have a celebration of these talks, and we're going to invite prominent writers to copy them, and everyone gets 2 or 3 pages or something, and Mo Yan's invited and he copies. Others didn't, including some of China's better writers. Wang Anyi said, no thanks, I'm not going to copy. But he did, not only did he copy, he said the talks in their time had historical necessity and played a positive role. Okay. What I want to do next is look at the origins of these two Nobel Prize winners very briefly, up to 1989, which was a turning point for both of them. Both born in 1955, Liu Xiaobo from Changchun in the northeast. He was 11 years old when Mao Zedong closed his schools. The Cultural Revolution closed all the schools. And many Chinese intellectuals have bemoaned the loss of their youthful education here. Liu Xiaobo said later that he thought that was a good thing. It was a blessing in disguise because he's a bookworm. And in editing this book, I think I was surprised to learn how much he's read. He really is I'd always thought of him as a kind of a gadfly, kind of stimulating trouble for its own sake and stuff. No, he is that. But he is a really well-read person. And he started reading in his youth. And he, in retrospect, said, I'm lucky I didn't have to go to school because I could read more good stuff, not having to read the official curriculum. And the most important lesson I learned was the lesson of 独立思考, independent thinking. He went to Jilin University in 1978 when the universities were opened again, not having gone to high school, self-taught, went to the Chinese department. 4 years later, went to do graduate study at Beijing. And 6 years after that, finished his PhD. Even while he was a grad student, though, he got famous. The first time I heard of him was a news report where he got in a public fight with Wang Meng at a conference, talking back to Wang Meng. People in those days, and probably even now, don't talk back to Wang Meng in public. Liu Xiaobo's character, though, you can tell is of that kind. He likes to look in your face and say, you're nuts, that's crazy, but not have it be personal. And his philosophy that I'll get to in a moment is this, no enemies, no hatred, but by the way, what you said sucks, So, as a grad student, he was already famous for, he's called Hema, a black horse of the Wentan, of the literary scene through those years. All through those years, though, he had an assumption that he later criticized, which is that the West can be the yardstick for China's progress. Chinese intellectuals don't think for themselves. Out in the West, they do. China has an authoritarian government with these problems. There's better governments out in the West. And then in 1988, he went to Singapore, then stopped in Hong Kong and went to Oslo, and then back to New York. And this trip, about more than half a year abroad, changed his view of that idea of using the West as a yardstick. When he got to Oslo, he went to a Chinese film conference with European sinologists in attendance and concluded that 98% of them are useless. They don't speak Chinese, for one. And they're very too willing just to accept at face value the government's view of things. Then he went to New York as a visiting scholar at Columbia University in the winter of 88, 89 and into the spring, and was smitten for reasons that he tells us in part, and he's got an essay in the book about this, but are part still unclear to me. He had kind of a transcendent streak came out in him. He went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he saw these great works of art. And he started to worry about the incompleteness of the individual person. And he was critical of the great Chinese writer Lu Xun for the first time. Lu Xun, who has such a penetrating, acid comment on Chinese society and politics and even national character, but according to Liu Xiaobo, staring at the emptiness of the grave, even Lu Xun doesn't know what to do and backs off. And if you read Lu Xun's Yecao, he's got a point about that. But Liu Xiaobo was suddenly smitten by this kind of level of things, and then he learned about problems in the West, the energy crisis, environmental imbalance, nuclear disarmament, and what he called the addiction to pleasure and commercialization. And the long and the short of it was that he no longer saw this Western yardstick as the way to measure human progress. And he said explicitly, now I have to do two kinds of critiques at once. I have to use that same Western yardstick to measure China's struggles to get out of its predicaments, but at the same time, use my own intelligence to critique the whole Western thing and problems. And he said he felt very humble. And here he is, this quasi-famous intellectual already, but felt like a worm at the bottom of a well. He had to start over, he said. Okay, I'm going to leave him there. I'm going to pick up Mo Yan for a moment. Born in 55 in Shandong County, Shandong Province, Gaomi Xian. He says that he had a very stern father who kept him intimidated and depressed. You can speculate on your own and on how that may or may not have formed his attitude toward authority later. Went to school for 5 years until the schools were closed for him too as well, and then went to work as a niutong, watching cattle. Age 19, worked in a cottonseed oil plant, and later joined the Army, 1976, and stayed in the Army until 1997, for which we should not blame him. As you probably know, in that era in China, you're stuck in your little village in Gaomixian, a poor village and stuff. How can you get out? How can you develop? How can you get anywhere? It's hard to go to school. It's almost impossible to go to college, very low rates. Joining the Army was one way to get out, and he did. All through this, though, ramshackle youth, he tells us, and I'm sure it's true, that he loved stories. He loved to listen to them. He loved to tell them. My feeling about his writing is that that's really the heart of it for him. He's a storyteller. He loves to tell stories, and he's good at it. The Nobel Prize Committee attributes influences on him from Faulkner and Gabriel Marquez and so on, but I think that's more Westerners kind of wishing that we had these influences. I don't really think he read much of those. And if you read his Nobel acceptance speech carefully, it actually says, well, 不认真看那些. 不认真 is the key word. Where did his literary roots, inspiration come from? From out of the earth of Shandong, storytelling. And to the extent that they were literary, I see them in Liao Zhai those ghost stories. The Nobel Committee talks about hallucinatory realism, where you're in an ordinary realist situation and suddenly a ghost walks in or a tree goes on fire and stuff, and oh, that must be from Faulkner or Marquez. No, I think it comes from things like Liao Zhai or Shui Hu Zhuan, which is also about Shandong, his local area. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all that right now. He made his name, did Mo Yan, in the 80s for a series of novelettes that went under the general title of Hong Gao Liang, Red Sorghum, that later Zhang Yimou, the famous filmmaker, made into a prize-winning film. That really was a contribution. And at that time, Mo Yan and Liu Xiaobo they didn't know each other well, but they're certainly intellectually and culturally more or less on the same page. And I'm going to read you from an essay that Liu Xiaobo wrote in 2004 about Mo Yan's work, Hong Gao Liang. He said, "It drew freely upon the themes of raw sexuality and adultery. Its theme song, Sister, Be Gutsy, Go Forward, was an unbridled endorsement of the primitive vitality of lust. Against the backdrop of fire-red sorghum in desolate northwestern China, under the broad blue sky and in full view of the bright sun, bandits violently abduct village women. Wild adultery happens in the sorghum fields. Bandits murder one another in competition for women. Male laborers magically produced the widely renowned 6 Mile Red by urinating into the heroes, brewing wine, and so on." If you've seen the movie, I'm sure Stan knows this movie very much. This is all there. And Liu Xiaobo says, that red sorghum could win prizes symbolizes a change in national attitudes towards sex. Erotic display had come to be seen as exuberant vitality. Mo Yan later points out, sort of in defense of his cooperation with the government, that he took a lot of flack for red sorghum, and he did at the time. He broke 2 taboos. One was to be that blunt and open about sex. And the other, from a political point of view, I think is even more important. he sort of deconstructed the official communist view of how peasants had resisted the Japanese. This story is set in the war against Japan. And of course, the standard version of that is Youjidui, and we annihilated them and we always win. Here, the peasants suffer and they tell on each other. And one of them gets skinned alive in the movie. That movie is, I've never seen a movie with a harder scene to look at than that one. All right, that's not the official communist version of how the peasants resisted the Japanese. So he did take flack for that. But now we get to 1989, a turning point for both of them. And with Liu Xiaobo, I think I left you with the impression that even before he left for Beijing, he was turning, he'd made a turn about this, not using the West as his yardstick anymore. There are a few other quotes I wanted to read you about why he, oh no, here they are, right, okay. Let's pick him up in New York again. By the way, he said at his trial that the first line of his self-statement at his trial was, June 1989 has been the major turning point in my life. So this isn't just my analysis, it's his. In April in New York, as the demonstrators in Beijing were getting more visible on the TV screens, and not just in Beijing, of course, every Chinese provincial capital at the time had demonstrations, not as well known, but they were there. He said, I hope that I'm not the type of person who, standing at the doorway to hell, strikes an heroic pose and then starts frowning in indecision. So he gets on an airplane, goes to Beijing, goes to the square, talks with the students, and on June 2nd, 2 days before the massacre, writes a June 2nd hunger strike declaration with 3 other of his intellectual friends who were at the square. And he writes this in the statement: we must begin to build democracy in China in a spirit of tolerance and with conscious cooperation. A democratic society is built not on hatred and enmity. It is built on consultation, debate, and voting that are carried out on a basis of mutual respect, tolerance, and willingness to compromise. And motherhood and apple pie kind of statement again. 2 days before the massacre, which of course he didn't know when he was writing this, but then when it came, it really put to the test this phrase about willingness to compromise. And as the troops came in down Chang'anjie, past Muxidi, and there were reports already of killings, he compromised. He and his other June 2nd hunger strikers went to the Chinese military authorities and said, let's arrange an exit for the remaining students at the square, because some of the students at the square were still ready to die and all of that kind of language. And that worked, and they did leave, and nobody was massacred in the square. And how many lives did he save by that compromise? We don't know. Dozens, certainly, maybe hundreds. Anyway, the next thing he did, he later really came to regret. And that was after engineering this exit, this peaceful exit from the square, he went to the diplomatic quarter and took refuge with a Latin American diplomat friend of his. And later he blamed himself intensely for this, because he said ones who stayed behind in the square to help the others themselves lost their lives or went to prison and so on. And he, the famous intellectual, was hiding in the diplomatic quarter, and that was a terrible mistake. So ever since then, he's had this image of the ghosts of Tiananmen who hover over his moral consciousness. And one way this shows is that every year on the anniversary of the massacre, he writes a poem. I'm sure he did it last June, too, in prison where he is now, although we don't have that poem. We have the ones up to the time when he did go, most recently, into prison. A man named Jeffrey Yang has translated and collected these in a book, by the way. Anyway, I'm going to read you from the poem that he wrote on the 10th anniversary in 1999. This is called 站在时间的诅咒中 standing in the blamings of time, if you will. It's a long poem. I'm just going to read you the first lump of it. To me, standing amid the execrations of time, that day seems so strange. 10 years ago this day, dawn, a bloody shirt. Sun, a torn calendar. All eyes upon this single page. The world, an outraged stare. Time tolerates no naivete. The dead rage and howl till Earth's throat grows hoarse. Gripping the prison bars, he was in prison in Dalian at the time. This moment I must wail in grief, for I fear the next, so much I have no tears for it. Remembering them, the innocent dead, I must thrust a dagger calmly into my eyes, must purchase with blindness a clarity of the brain, for that bone-devouring memory is best expressed by refusal. And it goes on. This is one stanza out of about 10. Moyen, after 1989, also made a turn in his life, both politically and in literature. Since then, he wrote 8 long novels and dozens of short stories. I haven't tried to count them. But made the decision to stay titrene, inside the system, which of course most Chinese writers most of the time do. Making larger or smaller accommodations to official guidelines, even as one needs to present the public appearance that one's doing no such thing. He went in 1991 to get a master's degree in literature from Beijing Normal University, which is poignant because that's the same place that Liu Xiaobo had been a lecturer. I failed to mention that when he did his PhD, it was such a hit in 1988. Everybody came, all the big professors, they gave him Liu Xiao, stay at the school to be a lecturer. It's a big honor in China. And he was a very popular lecturer until all of this happened. Then he was fired as soon as, he went to prison right after June 4th for 7 months in the Qincheng prison in Beijing. And when he came out, he was told that he was fired. But meanwhile, Moyen went there and got an MA degree. You can see that from Beishada's point of view, too. They have to play within the system. So our black sheep guy was an embarrassment, so we'll take in another one, and not just Moyen, others, to try to even the keel, as it were. Anyway, Moyen's new challenge after 89 was to find a new literary voice, something to make his name on. Now, if you go back to the 80s and read Sorghum, the 80s were a time when not just Moyen, but the commonest way to make your name as a Chinese writer in the 80s was to 打破禁区, break into forbidden zones, it was called. All these forbidden zones during Mao, and you say there was corruption, there was violence in the Cultural Revolution. If you dare to be the first to say that, you get on the map. Well, Hong Gaoliang, as I told you a moment ago, broke into 2 forbidden zones, one about sex and one about truth-telling about the War of Resistance. But after 89, it was harder to go that route. Because, for one, all of the obvious forbidden zones had already been broken into, and the ones that were left were really untouchable. Things like Falun Gong or Tibet or the private lives of top leaders and things that people talk about informally, but you couldn't do that. So that is not something you could do. So I don't know this personally, but my speculation is that he looked for another way to find a literary cutting edge. And what he found was this sort of semi-Rabelasian focus on the least common denominator levels of human behavior and experience: eating, excreting, fighting, screaming, bleeding, sweating, fornicating, and bullying, conniving, betraying. I just called it Rabelasian. I don't think it's as optimistic as Rabelais. Rabelais sort of got this sprightliness in his writing of the bottom level. Moyen, he's a good storyteller, but he just cranks this stuff out and people like to read it. And that was going to be his new, and has been, his new literary voice. Requiring him, though, to make a couple of compromises. Compromises that Liu Xiaobo clearly doesn't make. Here they're almost polar opposites. One is that when you write about all of these least common denominator, ugly aspects of human nature and so on, you keep it at a local level. All the bullies, all the oppression, corruption is at a local level. If you've read his book, The Garlic Ballads, where he clearly sympathizes with ordinary people who are suffering from oppression and bullying and so on by the higher-ups, it's the local party guys that are doing it. He doesn't ask the question, does it go to the top? And he doesn't ask the question, is this a systemic thing? Is it the system that's at fault, not just these bad apples? Whereas Liu Xiaobo is explicit about blaming the system, and not, by the way, blaming individuals. This is the hallmark of his final statement at his trial, where he said this: "I have no enemies and no hatred. None of the police who have watched, arrested, or interrogated me, none of the small fry in the system, none of the prosecutors who have indicted me, and none of the judges who will judge me are my enemies. We're all trapped in a system. You guys too." An idealistic thing to kind of say, and maybe not completely sincere, right? He wants this to be his belief. I can't believe that in his gut he really does like those guys so much. And he took a lot of flack from his friends. He said, "You can't say that. Those guys are SOBs. Don't just say that they're innocent victims of the system as you are." But anyway, that is his view, and it's, as you can see, polar opposite of the Moyen view of blame it on the moral failings of the little guys and don't ask about the system. The other area of compromise that Moyen makes, and here I'll tip my own hand, I don't like it when he does this, and you won't have any trouble perceiving this, I suppose, is that he makes fun of painful things. When I studied scar literature in the late 70s and early 80s, I found this was a pretty common phenomenon. We've just been through this 10年浩劫, all these terrible experiences in the Cultural Revolution, and when we write about it, we either do it superficially, or we look askance, or we use modernist language so that people don't quite know what we really mean, or we use history to borrow a metaphor, but we don't look at it, right? Moyen's way of not looking at it is to crack jokes. I'll give you an example from his long novel called 丰乳肥臀, Full Breasts and Fat Butts, you might translate it, which is a panoramic novel, goes from the 30s all the way to the end of the 20th century, and it leaves him the problem of, what do I do when I get to the Great Leap Famine or the Cultural Revolution? He gets to the Great Leap Famine in chapter 6 of this novel, and you all know about the Great Leap Famine and how it was caused by top-down instructions that you can plant rice close together and that you can interbreed things. Trofim Lysenko, the Soviet agronomist, somehow got word to Mao Zedong that you could do things like cross pumpkins and tomatoes in order to get giant tomatoes and stuff. So, food for fun, to be sure. And here's what Moyen does with it in 丰乳肥臀. Cross a rabbit with a sheep, says one character. Why not? A volunteer speaks up and says, "Sheep sperm into a rabbit is nothing. I don't care if you want me to inject Director Ludi's sperm into a sow's womb." And then, next line in the novel, everybody broke up laughing. Meanwhile, this is explaining the Great Leap Famine when, 20 million or more people died of hunger, but that isn't there. One of the protagonists in this story needs to go get some goat's milk, and somebody goes out and buys goat's milk, and he gets it, and there's no comment there. Goat's milk? People are starving, and you write about the easy availability of goat's milk, while Mo Yan knows that that's a very painful, sensitive topic and chooses to deal it with this askance laughter reaction. Another example is from his novel called Sheng Si Pi Lao, Exhausted by Life and Death, which is another panoramic novel that goes through these years. And when we get to the Cultural Revolution here, we see a victim of public humiliation up on stage for 4 pages being taunted by the people below stage, after which the crowd laughed uproariously. And then he has to eat a turnip that represents a, quote, fake donkey dick. This is because he's accused of having impregnated a donkey. All right, food for fun, to be sure. And his defenders, including the Nobel Prize Committee, refer to black humor. Well, I'll leave to you whether you want to consider this kind of thing black humor. I can't but think of the ones who really did suffer from these things and then watch it be described in this askance sort of way. And I also think the Chinese regime likes this kind of askance look at sensitive problems. 小骂大帮忙 is a regular kind of principle in Chinese literary control. 你不同意？我完全同意。你完全同意。Okay. Liu Xiaobo refers to this problem in an essay written in 2004. He says, sarcasm has turned into a kind of spiritual massage that numbs people's consciences and paralyzes their memories. It's that function of this daft hilarity that bothers me. Now, I want to spend a few minutes just saying what Mo Yan's defenders say about this. The main defense of Mo Yan that he uses and his defenders use, including my very dear friend Howard Goldblatt, by the way. I exchanged emails with Howard about all of this in question period. If you want to know that story, I'll tell it. But they say that this Nobel Prize is for art, not politics. So, Perry Link, you're pulling in all this politics, and so are the netizens on the internet. You know, leave the guy alone and art for art's sake. That's how you have to evaluate it. And I'm going to rebut that on a couple of grounds, 3 actually. One is, it's not obvious that the Nobel Prize is only for art. The original statement from Mr. Nobel, with whom I have no particular sympathy or anything, but his original statement said that the prize will be, quote, for the person who shall have produced in the field of literature the most outstanding work in an ideal direction. I don't know if it was English or Swedish, but that's an awkward phrase, right? In an ideal direction. But it does cast doubt on the notion that the purpose of the prize should be completely separate from ideals, right? And when you have somebody whose voice, ever since the early 90s, has been, you know, this lowest level common denominator of human nature, and you say this gets a prize for an ideal direction, I think there's room for argument there. Secondly, I won't give to Mo Yan the claim that he is separate from politics. He himself is involved in it. Of course, any Chinese writer has to be, but he goes farther than you have to be when he does this kind of daft hilarity response to tragedies in Chinese history. And I think you can also say, or at least speculate, that he benefits from the involvement of politics in literature in getting the Nobel Prize, because I still think there is considerable plausibility to the notion that the reason he was chosen is a political consideration about the feelings of the people whom we've just insulted by giving the other prize to Liu Xiaobo. And third, and I could talk a long time here, but won't because it's already past 5 o'clock. Even as a pure artist, it seems to me highly questionable. If you art for art's sake, if that's your standard, and you want to talk about metaphor and craft and so on, I would put Bai Xianyong ahead of him. Bai Xianyong is still living. I would put Ha Jin, even though he writes in English, he's a Chinese writer, very elegant craft in his stories. And among Chinese writers in China, Jia Pinghua's language is much neater and better considered than Mo Yan's, just on literary grounds. So, I'm not ready to just set aside what is called politics and say that, yes, he deserved the prize for art itself. Although I have to say, too, I'm not really opposed to his having gotten the prize. You know, I've taught Chinese literature for 2.5 decades now, and I regularly, all along, have taught 1 or 2 Mo Yan stories every time I do. He has some very charming stories that are certainly worth reading. And past 5, I'm going to cut to the quick here. One more, topic I want to just quickly address, and is I've argued that Mo Yan, after 89, turns a corner and consciously goes the route where he knows he'll have to make compromises, and he does. And I've sketched for you what I think the 2 main compromises he makes are. Now the question always comes up, well, do you blame him? I've said several times already that he's the norm for Chinese writers, for people inside the system. Most do make accommodations in order to stay within the system and do stuff. And I'm not ready to blame them for 2 reasons. One is I don't like what I call the armchair effect. And this hit me with considerable force when Clay introduced me, saying that I was one of the people that helped get Fang Lizhi and Li Shuxian into the US Embassy. And I brought them back out, and later George Bush invited them back in. That's a minor detail in the story. But when I got back to the US, I was especially irritated at responses from a lot of the young pro-democracy people who criticized Fang Lizhi for chickening out, going into the embassy. You could have been a hero. You could have been Tan Zitong, the late Qing reformer who said, all right, cut my head off, and they did, and then he's famous, he's Tan Zitong. I think it's wrong for people who sit in comfortable chairs like we have here at USC to look at the other side of the ocean and say, you should be a hero so that my aesthetic sensibilities are pleased more. I'm exaggerating now, but so I don't want to look at Mo Yan and say, you chicken, you should have done something else, on those grounds. And I said a moment ago I had another reason. Yes, this is even more important, and I'll let Liu Xiaobo make this point for me. People who stay inside the system and make their accommodations in order to push things forward inside the system sometimes do a lot of good. Sometimes, according to Liu Xiaobo, they are hypocritical in that. They say, no, I'm working hard inside the system, but really they're having a good time profiteering inside the system. But set those aside, some do. And I personally, and I'd rather not name names here, but I guess I will later if you turn off the camera. I know people inside the system in China who, in their thinking, are right about where Liu Xiaobo is. But they stay inside the system because they feel, and I think they're right for them, they can do more there. Liu Xiaobo writes about this kind of person in an essay that 2006, this is in our book as well. When people like me, who engage in high-profile confrontation with the regime, hear about people who are staying inside the system, perhaps pursuing matters in more low-key ways, the high-profile people should view the efforts of the low-key people not as errors, but as contributions that are complementary to their own. The decision by one person to pay a heavy price for the ideals he or she has chosen to pursue is insufficient grounds to demand that any other person make a similar sacrifice. Now, the obvious question here is, would Liu Xiaobo say that Mo Yan is this kind? I think not. He's not saying that that kind of compromise, the kind that picks up the phone and says, no, I'm not going to comment, I have guests at home, goodbye, is working maximally inside the system. But he knows other ones, and so do I, and probably you do too, for whom that's true. So for that reason too, I'm not ready by any means to make a blanket indictment of people who compromise with the Chinese government.